Sam, thank you so much for your time. Really awesome to get to, connect with you and talk a little bit of shop. For the listeners at home, will you tell us a little bit about your background, your motivation, and kind of where you are currently?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Newport, Oregon, which is a really small town on the Oregon coast. And I think when a lot of people think about Oregon, they think about Portland,
Hmm.
and that's not what the rest of the state is like. I mean, you lived out there.
Yeah.
So I come from a pretty country town, I
Uh,
guess I would say, maybe, and a really blue collar family,
okay.
which I've really loved. Both of my parents were first generation college students
Uh,
and student athletes, and they're both all Americans in their
yeah.
prospective sports.
Yeah.
And so being raised in a family that has a tradition of a really strong work ethic,
Hmm.
and then being a student athlete was a really unique experience. Like discipline
Yeah.
was everything in our household.
Yeah.
And we celebrated big for sure, but there was a standard of how we conduct ourselves.
Hmm.
And you were held to that standard all the time. So
Yeah.
like one of my dad's biggest fears growing up, I think, was that we would miss out on an opportunity because we didn't work hard enough. And
Mm.
so he really instilled that in us from a
Yeah.
young age.
Yeah.
And I think as far as like motivation goes,
Hmm.
I was also raised in a Christian church out there. And so treating people with respect and dignity is really big for me.
Yeah.
And my relationship with Christ has changed a
Yeah.
lot over the years,
Yeah.
as most things when you grow up and you
Yeah.
learn more and you do better. But I think as far as motivation goes, it'd be my faith and
Yeah.
then my family. And then it kind of sounds cheesy, but I think there's an element of justice to what we do,
Uh-huh.
right? Like
Yeah.
if we look at like the definition of justice, it's just behavior and treatment to
Mhm.
people and to things. And so I think that as a coach, you've got an accountability to justice,
Mm.
working with young student athletes that a lot of people might not always think about, but I think it's a really, really integral part of what we do.
Yeah, yeah. No, I like that. And then even with that, I mean, kind of working with people from a lot of different backgrounds, right? To speak on that justice thing, it really, I think that's a lot of where, you can see some of that, right? Because some of these people that are underprivileged or, coming from almost nothing, and then you kind of, you serve them essentially. So that's interesting. I like that answer. And then moving on with that, right? You have a little bit of a unique background. So will you speak on that a little bit and kind of your journey in terms of like career?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was actually just talking to one of my best friends about this yesterday
Mm-hmm.
because she's kind of in between fresh out of college. You got that first job out of college that pays your bills but isn't what you want to do. And so, when do we make that switch and when do we get into our quote unquote career?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that every position that you're in, regardless of how you think it may or may not relate to your career or your
Mhm.
degree that you got, I think it gives you an opportunity to be better
Yeah.
and to be more well-rounded and to be experienced and to be empathetic,
Mhm.
right, to some populations, like you said, that you wouldn't normally have experience with. And I think that there are qualities that beg to be developed in every season that we're in. So, like for me, I was a barista for a long time. In my time with Dutch Bros, I was a mobster, which is basically just like a culture coach. So we would, go around and teach people how to interact,
Yeah.
and how to love people really.
Yeah.
I was a server, I was a bartender, I was a volleyball coach at the, community college level, at a high school level, at a second grade level. I was a, track coach. I was a Spanish teacher, a health and PE teacher, a substitute. I had strength and conditioning internships and sports science internships. And so I think that all of that accumulated, every season that you're in has as much benefit to your growth as you allow it to, right? And so when we know that, or when we understand the fact that every position that we're in has as much development to who we want to be as practitioners and as humans as we allow it to, then the whole, quote unquote, finding your path becomes a lot less daunting.
Yeah.
And we can understand that every part of what we do, like when I was a teacher, goodness, it was so difficult.
Yeah.
It was so hard. And like, I don't speak Spanish at all. So like to go into a high school and to be, the Spanish department head, and have to learn the language every night before and then teach it and be in my master's program at the same time. It was so daunting, right? And then I was like, man, good thing that's over. That was the hardest thing in my entire life. And then I go in and I'm a middle school health and PE teacher, and my class sizes are, 50 plus kids, and we're 50% homeless in that school that I was at, and 93% below the poverty level. Like that comes with its own set of challenges that are completely different, but my ability to hold kids accountable while being empathetic to them was developed there in a way that would have never been developed in any other situation. And so in that aspect, even though sometimes when you look at my resume, you're like, this is super confusing. What, like when my first interview with Ernie, he's like, what do you want to do? Like, what is going on here? Like, such a good question. We become the humans that we're supposed to be when we really step with both feet into every opportunity that we're given. And so I think all of that to say, I was ready to step into this role at NC State as an assistant strength and conditioning coach and applied sports scientist because of the qualities that I developed. So whereas like I might not have the specific skills that you need me to have, but I've demonstrated that I know how to learn, right? Like I know how to learn the skills that can get the job done in a pretty short time. And so I'm one of those people that, I'm flexible and I'm fluid and I can figure things out and I can solve problems. And that's essentially what sports science is.
Yeah. Okay. And then will you talk a little bit, you mentioned, right, your time with Ernie. Will you talk a little bit about your time at Utah and what kind of things that you feel really, you took away from that department in that season of your life?
Yeah. So when I applied for that job, I had no idea what sports science was. I really hadn't heard of it that much. I knew that Kat Wade had told me about this guy, Ernie Reimer at Utah, and that he was super smart. And I was supposed to, follow him. That's what she said. And I was like, okay, sure, sounds good. So I saw this application for an internship, and I knew that I had a paid summer from my teaching. And I knew that I had like maybe 4 of the 7 qualities on there that were the required skills. So
over half.
And right? Yeah, right. And I believe that there's research out there that says that women don't apply for jobs until they have like 100% of the qualities listed, and that men are more apt to apply for jobs when they have half of the qualities listed. And so with Ernie, I know that he has wanted to have a female intern in there for a long time, and he never had because there just weren't applicants for it. And so I applied for it, and we had a great interview, and it was just a conversation, and I went out there having little to no idea what I was doing, what a sports scientist was, and I was so stressed because I was like, oh my gosh, this guy's a PhD, he's so smart, he's Ernie Reimer, and when I got out there, I realized that sports science is problem solving, right? So it's communication and it's interaction and it's being able to solve problems of performance and health and safety. And so I think when I was out there, I really learned like the framework for sports science. Am I a coding genius? Absolutely not. That's never why I would be hired for a position. But I think that Ernie was so good at celebrating the qualities that I had and that were really robust and developed and kind of, picking up the ones that I didn't. So I learned a ton about Excel and how to create things in Excel. I learned strategies for finding research and creating applications to what we're doing. But I also got to kind of celebrate my ability to create relationships with people. And my ability to communicate and to serve people. And he put me in a really, really incredible position to do that.
That's awesome. And so kind of keying in a little bit more on the training part, right? So what kind of is your approach to, you mentioned it a little bit, right? But your approach to data management and kind of sports science where you were at Utah, and how have you brought that to where you are now at NC State?
Right. So sports science is to research, to inform, and to innovate, right? That's what we do. I think as far as data management or sports science goes, you always have to be able to identify the problem, right? So if we're just collecting data or if we're just using technology or whatever it is, that's just noise, right? That it's not, we don't know what we're looking for. We don't know what problem we're trying to solve. So you really have to work backwards from it. And you have to identify what is the problem. And then we have to go into literature and see if we can find other times when people had that same problem and how they mitigated it. And if there's not, right, so we have evidence-based, and that's when specific protocols can be applied to what you're doing. And then we have evidence-informed, and that's where, you know, you might need to piece together different literature from different areas to come up with a potential solution. And when we go evidence-informed, that allows for innovation, right? So when we know the problem that we're trying to solve, sometimes there's times when people have solved that same problem and maybe it's a brand new problem. Regardless, we need to come up with a strategy to fight that problem and to mitigate it. And then we need to be able to audit it. And when we're implementing applications to mitigate that problem, I think that's where the relationship part of sports science comes in, because without relationships, sports science falls so flat. And that's part of sports science that I was able to learn there, because there's your soft skill scientist, right? And there's your hard skill scientist. And we need to be able to be both. We have to approach a coach, and the coach has to know that we're bought into their program. They need to trust us. The athletes need to trust us. We need to trust our athletes and our coaches so that we can implement this strategy and get a better indication of whether or not it's fixing the problem. And then after that, after we implement it, whether, you know, it's a brand new innovation or it's a, you know, time-tested strategy, we need to be able to audit it. And I think that's where your data management comes in, right? So if we know the problem that we're trying to fix, we know what metrics we're looking for. And when we're aware and we're informed on what metrics we're looking for, then we can audit it. So were we successful in that? If we weren't, that's all right. That happens, right? We have training programs sometimes that don't develop the things that we intended them to. So when we go back to the drawing board, we need to create a different strategy and look to see what else is out there. If it did work, that's great. Now we can know that that's a strategy that worked with this program to fix this problem.
Okay. I think one of the funny things that you mentioned is relationships in sports science, right? Because that sounds almost like an oxymoron. Like those two seem very contradictory, right? Like when you think of sports science, you think of someone behind a computer. So like, I think that's huge, right? You have to get away from being behind the desk, right? And you have to connect with what you're actually, the population you're actually trying to work with, right? Because again, like you said, it's going to build the trust, right? And then you're going to be able to get the, quote unquote, buy-in and be able to actually implement what you want to implement a lot smoother. So I think that's huge, right? Across our profession, across, you know, sports science, strength and conditioning, really across everything, which is kind of what you've been highlighting. So that's awesome to hear.
Yeah, I think there are times as a sports scientist too where you might have developed this really incredible innovation or presentation or brought something to light that, you know, in statistics has evidence that it matters, that it's affecting our athletes for whatever reason it is. And if you go to that coach and, you know, for whatever reason, they don't like you or, you know, you don't have that relationship and you present it to them, that's where it ends, you know, and that's part of that is sports science. Part of it is recognizing what problems need to be solved, and you go to that coaching staff and they don't agree. And ultimately it's their call, right? We are, although we are our own department of strength and conditioning and sports science, we're support staff, right? We're here to carry out the vision of those head coaches in that program. And so I think you have to have that relationship. And when you do, your reach and, you know, your effectiveness is only going to grow. Yeah.
And I think a lot of problem for young strength and conditioning coaches specifically is when they meet a coach and they don't necessarily agree, right? Coach disagrees, then they feel like that diminishes them as a professional, right? When it's really like you said, we're support staff, so we must not necessarily like fall in line and roll over, right? But we must like work together, right? It's all for one goal, and the coach is usually hopefully pretty good at their job, right? So you know, that allows us to be good at our job, but you know, we still have to be within the parameters, right? We still have to make sure we're working on the same goal. Yeah, that's big. Okay. And then kind of rolling on to the next question here, right? So you do a lot of work within your current PhD, right, with like female athletes, female populations. That's where some of your research is geared at. So specifically, what would some of your major variables of importance be for like a male versus a female athlete? Right.
So there's one fundamental difference, right, between women and men. And it's the fact that women have a menstrual cycle, right? So when we look at our endocrine system, in anatomy and phys in our undergrad, we're taught that our endocrine system's like our messengers, right? It's the communication. And if you've got physiological different building blocks, then the messages that are going to be sent are different, right? And I think that what's being communicated is different. And so we see things all the time about how women want to be treated like men, and there should be no difference in how you coach a female athlete versus how you coach a male athlete. And I think there's a difference between equity and equality, right? And when we look at that difference, we should give the same amount of our effort to our female and our male athletes, right? And I'm not saying that we're special, we need special treatment. But what I am saying is that female athletes deserve to be trained and treated per their own physiology. And I think that is a matter of justice. And there are a lot of things, a lot of barriers that are preventing us from being able to accomplish that right now, because we don't have a really widespread understanding of it. But I think when we look at the fundamental differences between males and females, I mean, when we train female athletes, we understand as strength and conditioning coaches that they're at higher risk of ACL tears, right? So we're going to put in some things that are going to be maybe a higher percentage of ACL risk reduction. But for some reason, when we look at the menstrual cycle, when we bring that up, a lot of coaches are a lot more against it, not necessarily against it, but just like wary of it. And so I think when we start to differentiate between our male and females, I don't want to be treated like a male athlete, right? I'm not a male athlete. I am a female athlete. I am strong, and I am, I'm a badass on my own, right? And that's okay. It's okay to say that. It's not a bad thing that I don't want to be treated like a male athlete. And so I think the biggest difference is that we are taking research done on 18 to 22-year-old young men, and we are applying it to women. And that happens for a few reasons. It happens because it costs more to do research on females, right? We have to consider the variable of their menstrual cycle, and it affects every component of performance. We also have to elongate our research so that it can account for the menstrual cycle, right? Because we know now, we're taught in school that a menstrual cycle average is 28 days long. And now we know that there's a huge research study that came out from the Clue app. And we know that an average menstrual cycle is a lot closer to 35 to 40 days. So that's something that's going to be different as well. And then there's also the component of a lot of times menstrual cycle is just kind of chalked up to a mystery, right? We're like, we don't really know about it, so we're just going to kind of put it to a side and use this research that we did on men. And then there's also the argument that, well, the differences aren't significant enough, so we can just apply it to women and it's going to work the same, right? And then we wonder why women don't have the same level of performance. And so I think there's a lot of different cultural components that go into menstrual cycle research and training. But when we look at giving our athletes our best, and when we look at just treatment, it goes back to training women on their own physiology. And it's a long process, right? We have to learn about it. We have to be able to implement it. There are so many different factors to consider, but are we giving them our best if we're not training them for them, right? Like in my head, I hope that like in 20 years we look back and we're like, gosh, I can't believe we didn't train women like women. When we train a soccer player, it's going to be different than the way that we train a basketball player. And when we train a man, it should be different than when we train a woman, because they're different. It doesn't mean that we are less. It doesn't mean that we are more. It just means that we're different.
And I think a lot of it, within the strength and conditioning, obviously more of a male-dominated profession, right? And you kind of mentioned, right, it's kind of a mystery, some of this stuff to us, and it's a mystery that we're a little bit uncomfortable to dive into. And by a little bit, I mean a lot. So, and part of it is due to the construct of like, this day and age, no one wants to cross any lines. And do you have any suggestions for, I guess, catering more to that, but at the same time, like, doing it in the most efficient, like, manner, if that makes sense.
Totally. So you bring up the fact that strength and conditioning is a male-dominant field, and it totally is. But we have some really incredible women that have come, before my generation that have laid some groundwork and a foundation for us to be able to step into these roles. And I don't think that we fight the same battles necessarily as the women that came before us, but that's not to say that we don't fight them, right? And then if we look at sports science, it's an even more male-dominated industry, right? There was an article that came out from journalists actually out here in Raleigh about how sexism in sports science is creating a more dangerous environment for our female athletes. And when we look at like male sports scientists in the NCAA, we don't have any females, right? So we don't have any female sports scientists in the NCAA right now. We have females working at the professional level, which is incredible, right? But when you are a male, you don't think to ask questions or to pursue research in subjects that only affect women because it doesn't even cross your mind, right? Like, I remember when I first went to Utah and I told Ernie about my research, and he was like, oh, that's interesting. And then as we went along, he's like, I think this goes way deeper than just resistance training. And so when we don't have women in those roles asking those questions, female athletes aren't taught that those are questions that can be asked, right? Like I never was taught that I could talk about the fact that I didn't have a period and why that's happening and why that's not healthy for me.
She said period, y'all. She said period.
She did. She said it. And so like, we have to be able to talk about those things. And unfortunately for a male coach or a male sports scientist, if you're uncomfortable, then they're going to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And there has to be a base level of comfort and trust to be able to talk about it. But before I was here, actually, Craig Turner was here. And he's with the Philadelphia 76ers now. But he actually talked to our women's soccer team about it. And so I'm really lucky that I don't have to go over that. I can speak from my own experience, right? And that, because I get it, because I've been there, because I've been a Division I athlete, and I know how it feels to be a woman in that stage, I can speak from that, and you guys can't.
True.
So I think that when you do, if we can approach it from a perspective of performance, right? Like, this isn't an excuse.
Yeah.
But it is a reason, and there's a difference between those two things, and it does affect our performance. So understanding how it affects our performance, and then how we can mitigate it and we can use it actually as an ergogenic aid is really important. But maintaining that performance perspective on things, I think, would really help a male coach when speaking to and when discussing these topics with his female athletes.
Okay. So switching gears a little bit, right? So I think that was a great kind of a foundation to lay. So now moving forward, how can we use some of this stuff practically? And how do phases, for example, how might a phase change or something within training actually look?
Right. So that's a good question, because I think one of the top questions that I get from strength coaches when I tell them about menstrual cycle, athlete management, and resistance training is that it's not feasible, right? Like, I have a team of 30 athletes. How can I count for every single one of their periods? Like, that's too much. And we have so many coaches out there that are already doing wellness surveys and have menstrual cycle in there, right? They ask, when was your last period? And so when we can break it down to the perspective of looking at a menstrual cycle and understanding it, just a really quick physiology lesson. Day 1 of our period is day 1 of the follicular phase, right? Then ovulation's in the middle, and that splits up the follicular phase from the luteal phase. And then through the luteal phase, that's when our body prepares for implantation, right, of a zygote. And so, or fertilization, excuse me. So when we look at our hormones in the follicular phase, they are closest to that of a man. So that's when you're going to get the most benefit from your high volume and your high intensity training. Your week of your period, all of your hormones are low because you're shedding your lining. There might be some symptoms of like uterine cramping or lower back pain. And that can be mitigated with some like magnesium and some baby aspirin. Because you've got higher prostaglandins in that phase. And then when we look at that, the second part of the follicular phase, that's when there's a little bump in estrogen. mirrored by a small bump in testosterone, and that signals ovulation. So in that phase, that you can have about 4 days before ovulation, there can be a 10% increase in your 1 rep max. So that's a great time to be able to set some training maxes. And then we go into the luteal phase, and the luteal phase is signaled by a large uptick in progesterone and estrogen. And with that, you'll feel a lot of physical symptoms. And then it's also marked by a massive downfall in both of those hormones. And when we have the downfall in both those hormones, that's like our PMS week. So we have wicked high progesterone and estrogen, and then it falls through the floor, and that's what signals the shedding of our lining. So when we're in that phase, the presence of progesterone creates a really catabolic state. And the catabolic state means that not only are we having a hard time maintaining our muscle, but the ability to build muscle is non-existent, right? So not only do we need higher protein content in that phase and higher carbohydrate content in that phase, but if you do a really difficult, strenuous session in the luteal phase, you're going to be doing more damage than good. So when we look at like the seminal study of menstrual cycle trigger training, it came out in 1995, and it showed that the control group trained every 3rd day, right? And that's pretty similar to like what we do with our athletes. Every 3rd day through 2 menstrual cycles. And that demonstrated, and it was just resistance training. And that showed a 13% increase in strength gains by the end of 2 menstrual cycles. So then they showed menstrual cycle trigger training, which went every other day for the follicular phase and only once a week in the luteal phase. And that demonstrated a 32.6% increase in strength gain.
That's huge.
So what that tells us is when we're doing really strenuous workouts in our luteal phase, because of the default catabolic state we're in, we're doing more damage than good. We can't build muscle. We're breaking down the gains that we made the 2 weeks previous. So what we can look at is when we program as strength and conditioning coaches, we've got 6 to 8 weeks programmed out right from the beginning, and we know how our volume and intensity is modulated. Essentially, all we need to do is assign those weeks to the cycle. So when we're in our follicular phase, if we've got a 2-week-long follicular phase, that first week we can go high volume, pretty high intensity. The second week we can cut our volume a little bit, maintain intensity, and hit some maxes. That 3rd week we want to bring volume and intensity both down to some moderate levels, and that 4th week is when we want to bring them down to our pretty low level. So when we look at it like that, it's a lot more feasible, right? Because that's in our language. But we need to understand the state that our athletes' bodies are in and what's the most prime session for that. So when you walk into a weight room, you don't know who's on their period, who just finished, who's about to start. You have no idea because they're doing the same workout, right? The movements are the same. But you might have one athlete that's in their high hormone phase and they're in the end of their luteal phase, and their volume, they've got like 3 sets, right, of their back squat or whatever it is. And then you've got their athlete that's on their period and they got 5 sets. Same lift, right? But the sets, reps, the work to ratio, that's what we can moderate so that we're allowing these athletes to get the most benefit from their sessions.
A lot of stuff there. Might have to digest that. Stuff, okay. Okay, so let's use an example of a women's soccer team, right? Because you're working with that one as well. So say it's early preseason, you have about 6 weeks roughly or whatever. We have our training set out, and this is like a base level program. So one way that we could possibly implement this would be you have your base level program, but then you could possibly put your people into buckets, right? Would that be?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. You can do buckets, or you can just assign weeks, right? Like if you got week 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we know that, obviously if they're coming in preseason, they've been training. So we've got a good base of training. It's not like we're just going to throw an athlete into a really high intensity lift and they don't know what they're doing. They put some months in that we've worked over the off season. So you can essentially just assign them to a week, depending on what week of their cycle they're in.
Okay. Interesting. And I'm going to ask a question. I feel like I'm in high school biology class here. So how does this get affected with females using birth control? I don't know if that has a place in this conversation, but in terms of like the hormonal milieu or whatever, how does that look and how does that change?
That's a great word, milieu, by the way.
I try to sound a little bit smart. You got a lot of big words in there, so.
That's a really good question because it does. It absolutely has an effect on it. So if we look at oral contraception, there's different types of the pill, right? But essentially what the pill does is it gives you mock hormones for 3 weeks. And then you have 1 week of your quote unquote sugar pills, right? That don't do anything. So if we look at the menstrual cycle that we just described, there's no time when hormones are like super constant other than that week of the period when they're really, really low. And so it takes that mock hormonal cycle and it slaps it on top of the one that you already have in your body. And with that week of sugar pills, your body will also have a tendency to shoot its hormones to the luteal level, your natural hormones, because it finally doesn't have an input of synthetic ones. And so you can have those effects when your hormones are supposed to be ideally low in that time because you're not getting any influx of them, but your body's like, oh, finally I get to have my own hormones, right? And it'll shoot it to the level of luteal. So that's something to be aware of with the pill. The pill has also demonstrated that your time to fatigue is longer and your ability to recover is shorter, or diminished when you're on oral contraceptive across your whole cycle. When you have athletes that are looking into birth control options, a hormonal IUD is a really good recommendation because although it's synthetic progesterone in the form of progestin, it's localized to the uterus. So it creates an environment in your uterus that isn't ideal to fertilization. And it also creates like a cervical mucus so that you're more guarded against cervical infections. And your body still has its natural hormonal cycle that you go through. A lot of athletes or women will lose their period when they're on a hormonal IUD because of the localized progestin effect. You don't build up a lining. So, that's something that is you have to think about. But even though you don't have a period on a hormonal IUD, you still go through the natural hormonal cycle. So birth control absolutely has an effect on our athletic performance and our training. And, like when I talk to athletes about it, I'm like, listen, I'm not an MD. I am not telling you what to do. But if you're on this, you should know the way that it affects your training. And that's it. It's simply from an educational stance.
Okay. Feel a little bit weird now, but good. But let's move on to a little bit more general concept, right? So moving into nutrition, how does this work? Well, I guess it's kind of on the same vein. How does nutrition and stuff kind of coincide with that? And do you have any general recommendations, right? Obviously, you're not a dietitian or anything, but like generally speaking, shoot for it.
Yeah, it totally does. Menstrual cycle affects everything, right? So when we look at our nutrition, there's some really specific symptom mitigation plans that you can implement with nutrition depending on what side effects people feel at different phases. So for me, like I feel brain fog and fatigue super significantly. And that makes sense because estrogen affects our production of melatonin. And progesterone, because of the catabolic state, we run hotter in our high hormone phase. So with that, we're just not sleeping as well. We have diminished thermoregulation and diminished production of melatonin. So cold tart cherry juice is something that you can drink before bed. It can help lower your core temperature a little bit and really high antioxidant properties. And then also can create what's the word I'm looking for? Like uptick the production of melatonin.
Okay.
You can also cool your bedroom down if you're in that high hormone phase, which can really help. And then we also look at like brain fog or the catabolic state by default, right, with progesterone. And that's where your protein content is really, really important. So branched chain amino acids are super helpful in that phase because we have a decreased amount of available leucine, right? So when we're in a catabolic state, our proteins, our amino acids are going everywhere to try and fix that breakdown. And when we have leucine is the only amino acid that can cross our blood-brain barrier. So when you have some brain fog, making sure that you get adequate leucine content in like before your workout and then after is really, really important to make sure that you're getting the benefit from that training session.
Dang. Okay. No, that's awesome. And then moving forward, kind of transitioning into a little bit more general stuff, right, about you. Would you have any recommendations to young coaches, sports scientists that are trying to do something similar to you or even just understand like technology better?
So I think For me, my understanding of menstrual cycle and performance and athlete management has all been on my own time. So I am in a PhD program, but we don't have any courses on sex differences. Like in my sports nutrition course, I think it was brought up one time in our like final wrap up of the class. You had to write like one paragraph on it. And so what I have a tendency to do is I'll take prompts for assignments or research, and I will spin it to female athlete specific. And that has allowed me to develop my understanding much more. I think you just have to start learning about it, right? Like you can't be afraid to ask the questions. Don't be afraid to sound stupid or ignorant, especially as a male coach, because it makes sense that you would have no idea what it's all about, right? And there's so much cultural implications of our menstrual cycles and how it affects us. We're taught from a really young age that when we're on our period, we're weak, right? Like that's our time of weakness. Like I had a friend text me and she was like, oh man, I'm on my period next week, so I know I'm going to be really weak. And I was like, this is our time of strength, right? Like this is when we can really get after it. The woman who had set the world record for the marathon had menstrual cramps. She was on her period when she said it, right? So understanding that the cultural things we're told about our periods aren't always true. Most of the time they're not true, right? Like we weren't allowed to run marathons because they thought our uterus was going to fall out. Like that's clearly not true. That's not the case. So, so I think just asking those questions and seeking out resources, it's not a topic that's so widely known that it's just going to come across your desk, right? You have to seek it out. And then as far as technology goes, I think that kind of goes back to like our sports science framework, right? So when we look at technology, if we're just buying it because other people have it, we have no idea how we're going to be fixing problems from it. And you're wasting money and you're wasting time of the person that has to develop it and manage it and, you know, disseminate the information from it because they don't know what they're looking for. And then we get into confirmation bias, right? Like if we think this is a problem and those are the only metrics that we look at and that's the only tech we buy, then it's going to become a problem, right? So we have to know kind of what the problem is objectively, how is the problem affecting our performance, and then what's the best route for technology that's the most feasible and usable for us that's available, and then do we have the manpower right to implement it,
or
because
woman
that's
power.
something else or woman power, right? Human power. And it takes time. Like technology is supposed to make things easier, but with all due respect, it rarely does.
100%.
So we have to know, like we have to have some like a framework in place that's set up that can withstand like turnover, right? So are we setting up systems that are going to be in place regardless of whether or not we are here as a sports scientist? And that's something I learned from Ernie too, is that developing or implementing technology is great, but then making sure that they are self-sustaining in that program so that we can then move on to start fixing more problems for other programs or just other problems for that same program. That's really important. So knowing why you're getting that technology, how you're going to use it, and then who's going to do it are all really important parts to tech.
Okay. I'm not going to lie, you kind of make a period sound like a good thing. I'm a little upset that we don't have one, okay? So
it's a lot of people like Stacey Sims is Dr. Stacey Sims. Her big thing is like using the period as an ergogenic aid. Like it absolutely is. It's our superpower.
Yeah. Well, that seems unfair. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, moving forward. So what are some resources that have had a big impact on you, whether that's like a book or a podcast or like conversation with somebody?
I think creating a network of people, of professionals that you can call on is really important. So this week we were looking at BFR and all the different uses of it. And so I texted Bradford Scott, you know,
shout out Bradford.
I know that he uses it. I know he uses it for recovery, and that's a different strategy than most people do. And so being able to create that network, or when I got this job and I knew I was going to be working with women's soccer, I was calling Kat Wade every single day. Like, I don't play soccer. I need help. Teach me soccer. And so creating that framework of professionals that you can call on and ask those questions. I remember when I took the job here, Ernie told me, he was like, obviously I'm sad that I don't get to work with you anymore, but our relationship won't change. He said, feel free to call me with any problem that you have, and, you know, I'll do my best to help you fix it. And so having those people that you've made those relationships with, maybe it started as a professional relationship, but it's clearly become, a personal one that you consider them a friend, or a mentor, or, in that facet that you care about them as a human first, and they care about you. I think that you can rely on those people and you can ask those questions because you know that you have that foundation of trust there. And then as far as resources of podcasts or books, I know that Dr. Stacey Sims has a book out there. It's called Roar. It's about, I think, 4 years old maybe at this point, but it's a really good place to start for people that want to understand the menstrual cycle in some simplistic terms, and then understand all the different ways to use it. And then Joel Jameson also has helped me a lot, especially working with soccer, with his book, Ultimate MMA Conditioning, just because it can break down the energy systems in a way to develop them. And it explains the strategies that he uses in specific ways, but general application, right? So I know exactly what component I'm developing with my athletes when I use this strategy, but I can use it in a lot of different ways. So that both of those have been really, really helpful.
Okay. And then last segment kind of here. If you have any, what are some quotes that you live by?
I remember when I was, maybe a sophomore at UP, and I was thinking about transferring, and Kat Wade told me never take a no from someone who doesn't have the authority to give you a yes. Right? And when you're a period scientist, for lack of a better term, there are a lot of people that are going to want to give you a no. But very few of those people are actually people that have the bandwidth to give you the yes that you need. So, don't let the no's get you down, because so few of them actually can have a bearing on your career. And honestly, finding an environment from a person that can give you a yes is huge, right? So when I applied for the job at NC State, Nate Brookerson created a position for me. He gave me the yes, and he created a position for me that I could give myself my own yeses, right? And I think that's really important. So finding someone that can believe in you and create an environment for you to be successful is huge.
Yeah, okay. Do you think that would be your best advice also?
When I was told with that, just to be myself, growing up in a really small town in Oregon, and wanting to be a really big time volleyball player didn't go hand in hand necessarily. And so I was told a lot that I was too much, that I played too big, my personality was too big. I'm a big person. And so I think just having the faith in myself, and looking at, when that imposter syndrome comes in, when you're about to do big things, that's kind of, for me, that's when I experience out of my lack of confidence. Because lack of confidence never comes when you're doing the small things, right? It comes when you're doing some big stuff. That to look at the facts and figures, right? Like, who am I? What do the people around me say about me? What do I say about myself? And then just maintaining integrity to who I am and what values I believe in.
I like it. Okay. So in contrast to that, what's the worst advice you've ever been given?
So I have a tendency to be, I'm not going to say annoyingly optimistic, but I will say that not everybody's down with it sometimes. And so I think that, like, I've been told, people are like, how's your day? And they're like, it's okay. And I'm like, it's a great day to have a great day. And like, find the good in your day. Come on. Like, there's gotta be some good in there. And people are like, how great can your day be if it's always great? Or things like that, or that optimism sometimes doesn't like allow for growth because you're not assessing what went wrong. And I think that there's both sides of it, right? Like, we can assess what went wrong, we can be better, but I think that I want to live a life where I'm stoked about it every single day, and I want to exude gratitude and optimism, and I want to, if I could infect the other people with a skill to find good in their day, then I've lived a good life and I've made the world better than I found it.
Okay. And final question here. What are some projects you're currently working on? How can people kind of reach out to you and follow your journey?
I think right now, taking the research from the literature and putting it to practical application is my big thing, right? So understanding all the different facets of how our menstrual cycle affects our athletes, and what are our applications we can do to maximize their training and their health and their safety in every facet. That's what Nate brought me here to do. And so that's what we're working on right now, the application of it,
Yeah.
you know, and getting the word out and telling other people about it. People don't even know about it.
Yeah.
If people would like to reach out, my Twitter and Instagram are Sam Moore Strong, SAMMOORE Strong. If they want to email me, you know, samraymore@gmail.com. I love when people reach out. I had like an athlete at University of British Columbia email me and asked if she could ask about how to do this for their swim team up there. And so, you know, anytime that people want to talk about it, I absolutely love talking about periods. I love talking about volleyball, you know, anything in my wheelhouse. I would love to take the time out of my day to talk to someone about it.
Fantastic. Well, Sam, thank you so much for your time. This has been fantastic. Definitely I'm going to have to pull out the bio textbook and go over some of the stuff you said. But it's been good. I think it's good. And I think, you know, we talked about it earlier. I think it's good to talk about it, right? To decrease the apprehension toward it. And so, thank you for your time and looking forward to connecting again soon in the future.
Awesome. Thank you so much, man.